The wolves emerged from the shadows like ghosts made flesh, their yellow eyes gleaming in the pale moonlight that filtered through the ancient pines of the Carpathian forest. Anya Petrov pressed her back against the rough bark of an enormous oak, her heart hammering against her ribs as the pack slowly encircled her, their breath creating silver clouds in the bitter winter air. She should never have been there. A governess wandering alone through the wilderness at midnight was either mad or desperate, and Anya feared she might be both. But desperation had driven her from the warmth and safety of Volkov Castle, where she had served for 6 months as tutor to the young ward of Count Dmitry Volkov, one of the most powerful nobles in all of Imperial Russia. The year was 1851, and the vast estates of the Russian nobility stretched across landscapes so immense they seemed to touch the very edges of the world. Volkov Castle stood like a Gothic monument against the Siberian wilderness, its towers piercing the sky like accusations against heaven itself. For generations, the Volkov family had ruled these lands with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves, their wealth built on timber, furs, and the labor of thousands of serfs who worked the endless forests and fields. Anya had come to the castle from St. Petersburg, fleeing a scandal that had destroyed her family's reputation and left her with nothing but her education and her determination to survive. The position as governess to 12-year-old Mikhail Volkov, the count's orphaned nephew, had seemed like salvation, a chance to earn honest wages while hiding in the remote wilderness until the whispers in the capital died down. But tonight had shattered that fragile hope. The largest wolf, a magnificent beast with silver-tipped fur and scars across his muzzle that spoke of countless battles, stepped closer. Anya could see her own reflection in his intelligent eyes, and she wondered if this was how her story would end, alone and forgotten in a forest that cared nothing for her dreams or fears. The events that had driven her into the night played through her mind like a fever dream. Count Dmitry's unexpected return from Moscow, his cold fury upon discovering what his steward had been doing in his absence, the terrible choice she had been forced to make between her honor and her survival. Viktor Kozlov, the Count's steward, had been making increasingly inappropriate advances since the Count's departure 2 weeks prior. Tonight, he had cornered her in the library, his intentions clear and his hands already reaching for her, when she had struck him with a heavy candlestick. The blow had sent him crashing to the floor, blood streaming from his temple, and Anya had fled in terror, certain she would be accused of attempted murder. In Imperial Russia, the word of a steward against that of a mere governess would seal her fate. She would be transported to Siberia if she was lucky, hanged if she was not. So she had run into the forest, hoping to reach the village 10 miles away, where she might find sanctuary in the church until she could plan her escape. But the forest had other plans. The wolves continued their slow approach, and Anya closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer for forgiveness for all her sins and for mercy for her soul. She thought of her parents, dead these 3 years past, and wondered if she would see them soon in whatever lay beyond this world. The sound of hoofbeats thundering through the forest shattered the eerie silence. Anya's eyes flew open to see a horse and rider emerging from the trees like something from a fairy tale or a nightmare. The horse was a magnificent black stallion that seemed to dance across the snow, while the rider was cloaked in dark furs and sat his mount with the easy grace of someone born to command. Count Dmitry Volkov. Even in the moonlight, Anya recognized his aristocratic profile and the way he carried himself like a prince of old. But what happened next defied all reason and explanation. Instead of charging through the pack to rescue her, the Count rode directly into the center of the wolves. And rather than attacking this intruder, the great beasts moved aside for him like courtiers, making way for their sovereign. The silver-scarred leader actually approached the Count's horse and looked up at the rider with what could only be described as recognition. Count Dmitry dismounted with fluid grace, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked among the wolves as if they were merely large dogs. He spoke to them in a language Anya didn't recognize, something older than Russian, older perhaps than any tongue spoken in civilized lands. The pack listened to whatever he was telling them, their ears pricked forward with obvious attention. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they melted back into the shadows of the forest, leaving only the Count, his horse, and Anya alone in the moonlit clearing. "Miss Petrov," Count Dmitry said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, "you appear to have taken a rather unusual evening walk." Anya remained pressed against the oak tree, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. "The wolves," she whispered. They listened to you." Wolves are intelligent creatures, the Count replied, approaching slowly as one might approach a frightened animal. They understand more than most people give them credit for. But how did you know I was here? How did you find me? Count Dimitri's silver-blue eyes seemed to glow in the moonlight as he studied her face. I know many things, Miss Petrov, including why you felt compelled to flee my home in the dead of night. Anya's blood ran cold. If he already knew about her altercation with Kozlov, then her situation was even more dire than she had imagined. My lord, I can explain. There is nothing to explain, the Count interrupted, his voice gentle but carrying an undertone of steel. Kozlov has been dealt with. He will trouble you no further. The simple statement carried such finality that Anya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. What do you mean? I mean that when I returned early from Moscow and found him bleeding in my library, it took very little investigation to understand what had transpired. The servants were quite willing to share their observations about his behavior toward you. Anya stared at him in shock. You believe me? Miss Petrov, I am many things, but I am not a fool. Kozlov's reputation with women was well known to me, which is why I left specific instructions that you were to be protected in my absence. The fault is mine for trusting him to honor those instructions. The relief that flooded through Anya was so intense, it nearly brought her to her knees. For months, she had carried the weight of expecting betrayal, of knowing that her word would count for nothing against that of a man. To have someone, especially someone as powerful as Count Volkov, believe her without question was almost too wonderful to accept. But why did you come looking for me? She asked. Surely a governess is easily replaced. Count Dimitri stepped closer, and in the moonlight, Anya could see something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. Perhaps, he said quietly, I have discovered that some things are irreplaceable. The ride back to Volkov Castle was conducted in a silence that seemed to thrum with unspoken questions. Anya sat before Count Dimitri on his great stallion, acutely aware of the strength of the arms that encircled her, and the steady beat of his heart against her back. The forest whispered around them with sounds that might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely, but no wolves appeared to challenge their passage. What will happen to Kozlov? Anya finally asked as the castle's towers came into view, dark silhouettes against the star-scattered sky. He has been dismissed, Count Dimitri replied, his breath warm against her ear. He left for St. Petersburg tonight, with a letter of recommendation that will ensure he never works in a position of authority again. Anya turned slightly to study his profile. A letter of recommendation for a man you dismissed? A very carefully worded letter, the Count said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, one that will warn any potential employer without explicitly stating anything that could be legally challenged. Kozlov will find himself unemployable in polite society within a month. The elegant cruelty of the punishment impressed Anya despite herself. In one move, Count Dimitri had protected her while ensuring that Kozlov could never harm another woman in his employ. It spoke to a sophisticated understanding of power that went far beyond mere wealth or title. As they approached the castle's main entrance, Anya saw servants waiting with torches and obvious relief. Mrs. Volkov, the elderly housekeeper who had served the family for 40 years, rushed forward with tears in her eyes. Miss Petrov, thank God you're safe. We've been searching everywhere for you. Count Dimitri dismounted first, then lifted Anya down with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing presence. See that Miss Petrov is given warm food and whatever she needs, he instructed the housekeeper, and ensure that her belongings are moved to the blue suite in the east wing. Anya started in surprise. The blue suite was reserved for honored guests, not servants. My lord, surely that's not necessary. It is entirely necessary, Count Dimitri cut her off. Your previous quarters were too isolated, too vulnerable. The east wing is safer. The implication was clear. He would not allow her to be placed in a position where she could be cornered again. But as Anya was led into the castle's warmth, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were deeper currents at work than simple concern for her safety. The blue suite was magnificent. A sitting room, bedroom, and private bath decorated in shades of sapphire and gold that spoke of imperial luxury. Anya had never stayed in such opulent surroundings, and she felt almost afraid to touch anything lest she somehow diminish its grandeur. A fire had been lit in the fireplace, and a tray of delicate foods waited on a side table. But what drew Anya's attention was the wall of windows that looked out over the forest where she had so recently faced death. From this height and distance, the woodland looked peaceful, even beautiful, but she knew she would never again see it as merely a collection of trees. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. "Come," she called, expecting Mrs. Volkov or one of the maids. Instead, Count Dmitri entered, having changed from his forest attire into an elegant evening coat of midnight blue silk. He carried a crystal glass filled with what appeared to be brandy, and his silver blue eyes seemed to catch and reflect the firelight. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her, with the fluid grace she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "Confused," Anya answered honestly. "My lord, I don't understand why you're showing me such kindness. I'm only a governess." "You are many things, Miss Petrov, but only anything is not one of them." Count Dmitri sipped his brandy, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Tell me about St. Petersburg. Tell me what drove you to seek refuge in my employ." Anya's hands twisted in her lap. The story of her downfall was not one she enjoyed revisiting, but something in the Count's expression suggested that he already knew more than he was saying. "My father was a professor at the Imperial University," she began slowly. "He taught literature and philosophy, and our family was well respected in academic circles. I was educated alongside my brothers, which was unusual, but not unheard of among scholarly families." "And then?" Count Dmitri prompted gently when she hesitated. "And then Prince Alexei Volkonsky decided he wanted me as his mistress." The words tasted bitter on her tongue. "He was married, of course, but that didn't stop him from pursuing me. When I refused his advances, he arranged for my father to be accused of sedition." Count Dmitri's grip on his brandy glass tightened almost imperceptibly. "On what grounds?" "He planted revolutionary pamphlets in my father's study, and then arranged for them to be discovered during a surprise inspection. My father was arrested, tried and transported to Siberia within a week. He died on the journey. Tears threatened, but Anya forced them back. My mother died of grief 6 months later. Prince Alexei then offered to restore our family's honor if I became his kept woman. But you refused." "Of course I refused. I sold everything we owned to pay for passage as far from St. Petersburg as possible and found employment as a governess. I thought I had escaped." Count Dmitri was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried a dangerous undertone that reminded Anya of the way he had commanded the wolves in the forest. "Prince Alexei Volkonsky will find that his influence extends less far than he imagines," he said finally. "My lord, nothing that need concern you, Miss Petrov, but rest assured that your family's honor will be restored, with or without the prince's cooperation." Anya stared at him in shock. "So how could you possibly? I have considerable influence in certain circles," Count Dmitri replied smoothly. "The Volkov family is older and more powerful than the Volkonskys, and we have longer memories." The casual display of power was breathtaking. With a few words, Count Dmitri had just promised to undo the machinations of one of the most influential men in the Russian Empire. Either he was extraordinarily confident in his abilities, or he was something far more than he appeared. "Why?" Anya whispered. "Why would you do such a thing for someone like me?" Count Dmitri set down his brandy and leaned forward, his intense gaze never leaving her face. "Because, Miss Petrov, I suspect that you and I have more in common than you might think. We are both creatures who have learned to survive in a world that can be predatory." Something in his tone made Anya's pulse quicken. "I don't understand. Don't you?" Count Dmitri rose and moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the starlit glass. "You've noticed things about me, about this place, things that don't quite fit with ordinary explanations." Anya's mind raced back through the months she had spent at the castle, Count Dmitri's frequent absences, during which no one seemed to know exactly where he went, the way servants spoke of him in hushed, almost reverent tones, the fact that no bandits ever troubled his lands despite their remoteness, and tonight, the impossible scene with the wolves. "The wolves," she said softly. "They knew you." "The wolves recognize power," Count Dmitri corrected, turning back to face her, "as do most creatures of the wild. The question is whether you're prepared to accept what that might mean." Before Anya could respond, the door burst open without ceremony. Young Mikhail Volkov rushed in, still in his nightclothes, his face streaked with tears. "Uncle Dmitri, Miss Petrov, I heard you were hurt. I heard you had run away." The boy threw himself at Anya, wrapping his arms around her waist, with the desperate relief of a child who had feared losing another important person in his short life. "I'm perfectly safe, Mikhail," Anya assured him, smoothing his dark hair with gentle fingers. "Your uncle made sure of that." Mikhail looked up at Count Dmitri with eyes that held both love and something that might have been awe. "You found her in the forest? At night?" "I did," Count Dmitri confirmed, and Anya noticed that he didn't elaborate on the circumstances. "The servants say there are wolves in the forest," Mikhail continued with the morbid fascination of youth. "Big ones with yellow eyes." "Were you afraid, Miss Petrov?" Anya glanced at Count Dmitri, who was watching the exchange with unreadable eyes. "Yes," she said truthfully. "I was very afraid, but your uncle arrived just in time." "Uncle Dmitri always knows when people need help," Mikhail said with complete confidence. "He's the strongest man in all of Russia. He could fight 100 wolves and win." "That's quite enough excitement for one evening, Mikhail," Count Dmitri said gently but firmly. "Miss Petrov needs rest, and you should be in bed." As the boy was led away by Mrs. Volkov, Count Dmitri lingered in the doorway. "We'll continue this conversation another time, Miss Petrov, when you've had time to consider what you're truly prepared to accept." After he left, Anya stood at the window, looking out at the forest, her mind spinning with questions that seemed to have no rational answers. What was Count Dmitri Volkov? And why did she find herself desperately wanting to know? Despite every instinct that warned her, some knowledge came with a price too high to pay. 3 weeks passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. Anya resumed her duties teaching Mikhail, but now from the luxury of the blue suite rather than her former modest quarters. Count Dmitri was unfailingly courteous, but maintained a careful distance, as if waiting for something. The castle's routine continued unchanged, yet Anya felt as though she was living in the eye of a storm that could break at any moment. The first sign that her world was about to shift came in the form of a letter delivered by an imperial courier on a snow-bright morning in late February. Mrs. Volkov brought it to Anya during breakfast, her weathered face creased with concern. "It's from St. Petersburg, miss," she said quietly. "Official seal." Anya's hands trembled as she broke the wax. Inside was a formal document bearing the signature of the Tsar himself, posthumously pardoning Professor Pavel Petrov of all charges of sedition and declaring that his arrest had been based on false evidence provided by unnamed conspirators who had now been brought to justice. "Dear God," Anya whispered, sinking into her chair. "He actually did it. Miss Petrov." Mikhail looked up from his morning mathematics with concern. "Are you ill?" "No, darling," Anya managed, though tears were streaming down her cheeks. "I've just received wonderful news. My father has been declared innocent of the charges that led to his exile. It should have been pure joy." This vindication she had never dared hope for, but alongside her relief came a profound unease. Count Dmitri had promised to restore her family's honor, but the speed and completeness with which he had accomplished it suggested connections and influence that went far beyond ordinary nobility. That evening, Anya was summoned to Count Dmitri's private study, a room she had never entered before. It was a masculine space filled with ancient books, military maps, and artifacts that seemed to span centuries. The Count stood before a massive fireplace, still dressed in riding clothes from what appeared to have been a long journey. "You received the pardon," he said without preamble. "Yes." Anya approached slowly, her eyes drawn to a glass case containing what appeared to be medieval weapons. "How did you manage it so quickly? I told you I had influence in certain circles." Count Dmitri turned to face her, and in the firelight, his eyes seemed to gleam with an inner radiance. "Are you satisfied with the result?" "Satisfied doesn't begin to cover it," Anya replied honestly. "My father's name is cleared, my family's honor restored. I can never repay you for this gift." "Can't you?" Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "There is something I need to tell you, Anya. Something I've been waiting to share until you were ready to hear it." The use of her first name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. "What is it?" Count Dmitri moved to his desk and withdrew a leather portfolio. "Your employment here was not the accident you believed it to be. I arranged for you to be offered this position." Anya felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I knew about your situation in St. Petersburg before you ever left the city. I knew about Prince Alexei's pursuit, about your father's false arrest, about your family's destruction. And I arranged for my agent to offer you sanctuary here." "But why?" Anya's voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you involve yourself in the affairs of complete strangers?" Count Dmitri opened the portfolio and withdrew a miniature portrait in an ornate gold frame. He handed it to Anya without a word. The painting showed a young woman with auburn hair and violet blue eyes, wearing the court dress of a bygone era. She might have been Anya's twin, so striking was the resemblance. "Who is she?" Anya breathed. Katerina Volkov, my great-grandmother. She died in 1789, murdered by agents of Prince Ivan Volkonsky, great-grandfather of your Prince Alexei." The portrait trembled in Anya's hands. "I don't understand." "The Volkovs and Volkonskys have been enemies for over a century," Count Dmitri explained, his voice carrying the weight of old hatred. "It began when Ivan Volkonsky coveted Katerina, just as his descendant coveted you. When she refused his advances, he had her accused of witchcraft. She was burned at the stake in Red Square while her husband, my great-grandfather, was away on military campaign." Anya stared at the miniature, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. "You brought me here because I looked like her." "I brought you here because the pattern was repeating itself," Count Dmitri corrected. "A Volkonsky destroying an innocent woman to satisfy his desires, using false charges and state power to achieve his ends. I couldn't save Katerina, but I could save you. And now you've had your revenge," Anya said quietly. "Prince Alexei's reputation is in ruins, just as he ruined my father's." "Yes," Count Dmitri's admission was stark in its simplicity. "But what began as revenge has become something else entirely." He moved closer, close enough that Anya could see the conflict in his extraordinary eyes. "I brought you here to save you from a Volkonsky, yes, but I've kept you here because I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither could uncross. Anya felt her heart racing, torn between gratitude, confusion, and something deeper that she had been trying to ignore for weeks. "How can you love me?" she asked. "You don't really know me. You brought me here because I reminded you of someone else." "I brought you here because of Katerina, yes," Count Dmitri agreed. "But I've learned to love you for yourself, your intelligence, your courage, your kindness to Mikhail, your strength in the face of adversity. You're not Katerina's ghost, Anya, you're yourself, and that is who I've come to cherish." Before Anya could respond, a commotion erupted from the courtyard below. Through the study windows, they could see torches approaching through the forest, many torches moving in organized formation. Count Dmitri's expression darkened. "It seems Prince Alexei has friends after all." Mrs. Volkov appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "My lord, armed men are surrounding the castle. They carry the banner of Prince Volkonsky." Anya felt her blood turn to ice. "He's come for me." "No," Count Dmitri said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "He's come for revenge, and he'll find more than he bargained for." As the sound of horses and men filled the night air, Count Dmitri moved to another glass case and withdrew a sword that seemed to gleam with its own light. The blade was ancient, but perfectly maintained, and strange symbols were etched along its fuller. "Anya," he said, turning to face her with eyes that now seemed to burn within a fire, "there are things about me, about my family, that you need to know. Things that will change how you see everything." "What things?" Before he could answer, the great doors of the castle burst open below, and Prince Alexei Volkonsky's voice echoed through the halls, commanding and cruel. "Dmitri Volkov, I've come to collect what's mine." Count Dmitri's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. "Then he'll learn what it truly means to hunt a wolf in his own territory." As armed men poured into the castle below, Anya realized that the man she had been falling in love with was about to reveal secrets that would either destroy her world or transform it entirely. "Stay here," Count Dmitri commanded, his hand on the door handle. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, do not leave this room." But Anya caught his arm, her fingers gripping the fine wool of his coat. "No. If this is about me, I won't hide while you face danger alone." Count Dmitri's eyes blazed with something that was no longer entirely human. "Anya, you don't understand what you're asking. What I'm about to become is not something you should witness." "I've seen you command wolves," she said firmly. "Whatever else you are, I'm not afraid of you." For a moment, Count Dmitri stared at her with an expression of such profound longing that it took her breath away. "You should be," he said softly, "but perhaps that's why I love you." The sounds of conflict were growing closer, shouting men, clashing steel, and something else, something that sounded like the howling of wind through mountain peaks. Count Dmitri pressed the ancient sword into Anya's hands. "If anything happens to me," he said, "take this blade and find the hidden passage behind the bookshelf. It will lead you to the stables. Ride hard for the village, and don't look back." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Anya said fiercely. "I won't allow it." Despite everything, Count Dmitri smiled, spoken like a true Volkov. Before Anya could ask what he meant, the study door exploded inward. Prince Alexei Volkonsky strode into the room flanked by 6 armed men, his handsome face twisted with triumph and rage. He was exactly as Anya remembered. Tall, blonde, with the cruel beauty of a fallen angel, and eyes like chips of blue ice. "Dmitri," he said mockingly, "still playing the provincial lord, I see, and Miss Petrov." His gaze slithered over Anya like something oily and cold. "You've led me quite a chase, my dear, but all games must end. The only thing ending tonight is your delusion that you can take what doesn't belong to you," Count Dmitri replied, moving subtly to place himself between Anya and the intruders. Prince Alexei laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Belong to me? My dear Dmitri, she's already belonged to me for over a year. I simply allowed her to think she had escaped." "What do you mean?" Anya demanded, though ice was already forming in her veins. "Did you really think your employment here was chance?" Prince Alexei continued with obvious relish. "I arranged for you to be offered this position. I wanted you isolated, alone, dependent on the kindness of a man I could easily manipulate or destroy. I never intended for you to actually find happiness here." Count Dmitri had gone very still, his silver blue eyes fixed on Prince Alexei with predatory intensity. "You arranged for her employment? Of course, I have agents throughout the empire. When my initial approach failed, I decided to let you break her spirit for me. Remote castles, harsh winters, the slow grinding down of hope. It's amazing how compliant a woman becomes when she's been properly seasoned." Anya felt sick. Everything she had believed about her rescue, about finding sanctuary, had been another manipulation by the man who had destroyed her family. Even Count Dmitri's kindness had been part of Prince Alexei's larger design. "But then," Prince Alexei continued, "you had to go and develop actual feelings for the creature. Really, Dmitri, I expected better from you. She's pretty enough, I grant you, but hardly worthy of the attention you've lavished on her." "You're wrong about everything," Count Dmitri said quietly, but there was something building in his voice, something that made the very air in the room seem to thrum with tension. "Am I? Then why don't you tell her the truth about why you really brought her here? Tell her about the portrait, about dear departed Katerina, about your family's obsession with revenge." Anya's heart clenched as she saw the truth in Count Dmitri's face. "You did bring me here because of the portrait," she whispered, "because I reminded you of her." "Anya," Count Dmitri began, but Prince Alexei cut him off with delighted laughter. "Oh, this is perfect. Neither of you realized you were dancing to my tune. Dmitri, you played your part beautifully. The noble rescue, the growing affection, the promise of love, all of it designed to make her fall completely under your protection, so I could take her away just when she felt safest." "And what makes you think I'll allow you to take her anywhere?" Count Dmitri asked, his voice now carrying undertones that seemed to vibrate in Anya's bones. "Because," Prince Alexei said, drawing an ornate pistol from his coat, "you're outnumbered, outgunned, and far from any help. Your servants are either dead or fled. Your precious Mikhail is my prisoner, and you have no choice but to surrender." At the mention of Mikhail, Count Dmitri's control finally snapped. The change that came over him was unlike anything Anya had ever witnessed. His eyes blazed with silver fire. His form seemed to grow larger and more imposing, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of ancient forests and winter storms. "Release the boy," he commanded, and every man in the room felt the compulsion behind the words like a physical force. Prince Alexei's confident smile faltered. "What? How? Release him now, or face the consequences of threatening what is mine." But Prince Alexei, for all his cruelty, was no coward. He raised his pistol toward Count Dmitri with steady hands. "I don't know what tricks you're playing, but they won't save you." The shot rang out in the confined space, deafeningly loud. Anya screamed as she saw Count Dmitri stagger backward, blood blooming across his white shirt. But instead of falling, he straightened, his silver eyes now burning with inhuman fire. "Iron bullets," Prince Alexei breathed, understanding flooding his face. "I came prepared for what you are, Dmitri Volkov." Count Dmitri looked down at the wound, then back at Prince Alexei. When he smiled, Anya saw that his teeth had become sharp, predatory. "Then you understand that you've just made a very serious mistake." The transformation was both terrifying and magnificent. Count Dmitri's human form melted away like shadow before dawn, replaced by something far older and more powerful. Where a man had stood, now crouched an enormous wolf with silver-tipped fur and eyes that burned like stars. But this was no ordinary wolf. It was something from the deepest legends, a creature of power and ancient magic. Prince Alexei's men raised their weapons, but Count Dmitri moved faster than human eyes could follow. In seconds, 3 of them were down, their weapons scattered across the floor. The remaining men fled in terror, leaving only Prince Alexei standing frozen with his empty pistol. But the iron bullet had done its work. Even in his transformed state, Count Dmitri was weakened, his movements slower than they should have been. Prince Alexei saw the weakness and drew a silver dagger from his boot. "Silver and iron," he said, advancing on the wounded wolf. "The old ways of dealing with your kind." Anya didn't think, she simply moved. The ancient sword Count Dmitri had given her sang through the air, its blade intercepting Prince Alexei's dagger with a ringing clash that sent sparks flying through the room. "You want him?" she said, raising the sword with hands that no longer trembled. "You'll have to go through me first." Prince Alexei stared at her in shock. "You can't be serious. You'd fight for a monster." "I'd fight for the man I love," Anya replied firmly. "Monster or not, he's shown me more kindness and honor than you ever could." Behind her she heard the sound of transformation again, and Count Dmitri's human voice, weak but determined. "Anya, get away from him. He's more dangerous than you know." "No," she said, not taking her eyes off Prince Alexei. "We face this together." For the first time in her life, Anya Petrov wasn't running from danger. She was standing her ground to protect the man who had given her back her world. The silver dagger in Prince Alexei's hand gleamed with malevolent purpose as he circled Anya, his blue eyes calculating the best angle of attack. Behind her, Count Dmitri struggled to remain upright, the iron bullet having done more damage than he had initially realized. The ancient sword felt heavy in Anya's grip, but she held it steady, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is foolish, Miss Petrov," Prince Alexei said conversationally. "You're a governess with no training in combat, facing a man who has killed dozens in duels and wars. Set down the sword, and I promise your death will be quick." "And if I don't?" Anya asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Then I'll make you watch while I slowly carve pieces from your monster lover before finishing him forever." Prince Alexei's smile was sharp as winter. "Silver through the heart, you know. The only way to kill one of his kind permanently." Count Dmitri tried to step forward but stumbled, the iron poisoning his system faster than his supernatural constitution could heal it. "Anya," he gasped, "the sword you hold, it's not just any blade, it belonged to Katerina, it has power." Before Anya could ask what he meant, Prince Alexei lunged forward with deadly speed. Training or no training, pure instinct guided Anya's response. She brought the sword up in a defensive arc that caught the dagger's thrust and turned it aside, the ancient steel ringing like a bell. "Impossible," Prince Alexei breathed, staggering back. "No untrained woman could—" He didn't finish the sentence, because Anya was already attacking, the sword moving in her hands as if it had a will of its own. Patterns of movement flowed through her mind, centuries of combat knowledge that seemed to come from the blade itself. She was no longer just Anya Petrov, the governess. She was the inheritor of something far older and more dangerous. Prince Alexei parried desperately, his dagger work skilled but suddenly inadequate against the supernatural grace that now guided Anya's every movement. Around them, the study was being destroyed, furniture splintering as they fought across the room, ancient books tumbling from their shelves, glass cases shattering under the force of their combat. "What are you?" Prince Alexei demanded, as Anya's blade sliced through his coat, barely missing flesh. "I'm learning that myself," Anya replied, pressing her attack. The sword seemed to sing in her hands, its edge trailing silver light that left after-images in the air. But Prince Alexei was far from finished. With a snarl of rage, he abandoned finesse and drew a second weapon, a pistol loaded with silver bullets. "If I can't cut you down, I'll shoot you down." The gun's roar filled the room, but Anya was already moving, guided by instincts she didn't fully understand. The bullet scored along her shoulder, drawing blood but failing to stop her momentum. She closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, the ancient sword's pommel striking Prince Alexei's temple with crushing force. He dropped both weapons and fell to his knees, blood streaming from the wound. But even dazed, he remained dangerous. His hand closed around a shard of glass from one of the broken cases, and he lunged upward, aiming for Anya's throat. The glass never reached its target. Count Dmitri, summoning reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, seized Prince Alexei's wrist and twisted sharply. The sound of breaking bone filled the room, followed by Prince Alexei's scream of pain and rage. "It's over, Alexei!" Count Dmitri said, his voice carrying final authority. "You've lost." "Have I?" Prince Alexei laughed through his pain. "Even if you kill me, the damage is done. The Tsar's agents are already investigating the mysterious circumstances surrounding your recovery of Miss Petrov. They know about the wolves, about the strange loyalty of your servants, about the fact that no bandits dare approach your lands. How long before they realize what you truly are?" Anya felt ice forming in her veins. She had been so focused on their personal battle that she hadn't considered the larger implications of Prince Alexei's pursuit. "You see," Prince Alexei continued, "I always plan several moves ahead. If I couldn't have you, Miss Petrov, then I would ensure that your monster's secret was exposed. The Tsar has a particular hatred for supernatural creatures, something about his grandfather's unfortunate encounter with a witch. When his agents arrive tomorrow, they'll find all the evidence they need to justify burning this entire castle to the ground." Count Dmitri's face went pale. "Mikhail, we'll burn with the rest of you unless you give me exactly what I want." Prince Alexei struggled to his feet, cradling his broken wrist. "Here are my terms. Miss Petrov comes with me willingly. You and the boy disappear forever into the deep wilderness, and I'll call off the investigation." "No," Anya said immediately. "I won't leave with you under any circumstances." "Then the boy dies tomorrow," Prince Alexei replied coldly, "along with everyone else in this castle. The Tsar's investigators don't concern themselves with innocent casualties when supernatural threats are involved." Anya looked at Count Dmitri and saw the terrible conflict in his face. He was being forced to choose between her freedom and his nephew's life, and the choice was tearing him apart. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "There is," Count Dmitri said quietly, and something in his tone made both Anya and Prince Alexei go very still. "What?" Prince Alexei demanded. Count Dmitri straightened, and despite his wounds, authority radiated from him like heat from a forge. "You made one critical error in your planning, Alexei. You assumed I was the only supernatural creature under this roof." He turned to look at Anya with eyes that held both love and profound sadness. "The sword didn't just lend you skill, did it? You felt something else, something awakening inside you." Anya nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "I felt connected. To the castle, to the forest, to—" She looked at her hands, which still tingled with residual power. "To you. The Volkov bloodline carries more than just nobility," Count Dmitri explained. "Katerina wasn't just my great-grandmother. She was also gifted with abilities that made her dangerous to those who would oppress the innocent. That's the real reason Ivan Volkonsky had her killed." Prince Alexei was backing toward the door, fear finally replacing his smug confidence. "That's impossible. She's not a Volkov, isn't she?" Count Dmitri smiled, and for the first time since the attack began, he looked genuinely pleased. "Anya, what was your grandmother's maiden name?" "Volkova," Anya whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. "Maria Volkova, Katerina's sister," Count Dmitri confirmed, "who escaped to St. Petersburg during the persecution and married under an assumed name. You're not just a woman who resembles my great-grandmother, Anya. You're her great-grand-niece. Your family." The revelation hit like lightning. Everything, her connection to the castle, her ability to wield Katerina's sword, the way the ancient blade had seemed to recognize her, suddenly made perfect sense. And with understanding came power. Anya felt the change beginning in her very bones, a transformation that was gentler but no less profound than Count Dmitri's. The blood of wolves might flow in his veins, but the blood of something equally ancient flowed in hers. When she turned to face Prince Alexei, her eyes blazed with silver fire that matched her beloved's, and her voice carried the authority of storms and starlight. "You wanted to know what I am?" she said, taking a step toward the man who had destroyed her life. "I'm a Volkov, and you just threatened my family." The power that surged through Anya was unlike anything she had ever imagined. It wasn't the raw primal strength that she had witnessed in Count Dmitri's transformation, but something more subtle and infinitely more terrifying. Where his abilities drew from the wild hunt and the ancient pack, hers came from the deep magic that had protected the Russian forests since time immemorial. Prince Alexei pressed himself against the study door, his face white with sudden understanding. "This is impossible. The Volkov witch line died with Katerina." "Clearly not," Anya replied, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very stones of the castle. As she spoke, frost began to form on the windows, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "Though I'm beginning to understand why my grandmother never spoke of her heritage." Count Dmitri, despite his wounds, was watching the transformation with wonder rather than fear. "Anya, you need to be careful. The power you're feeling, it can overwhelm you if you're not prepared." "I can handle it," Anya said, though part of her was terrified by the rightness of the magic flowing through her veins. This wasn't some foreign force she was wielding. It was coming home. Prince Alexei made a desperate lunge for his fallen pistol, but Anya simply gestured with one hand. The weapon flew across the room, as if pulled by invisible strings, landing in the fireplace where it was quickly consumed by flames that burned silver and cold. "Now then," Anya said conversationally, "let's discuss your terms again, but this time I'll be setting them." "You can't touch me," Prince Alexei blustered, though his voice shook with fear. "I have protection, wards blessed by the Orthodox Church." "Against wolves, perhaps," Anya interrupted. "But I'm not a wolf." She took another step closer, and Prince Alexei whimpered as ice crystals began forming in his hair and on his clothes. "I'm something much older and far less forgiving." "What do you want?" Prince Alexei whispered. "Justice," Anya replied simply. "You destroyed my family, murdered my father through false accusations, and drove my mother to an early grave. You pursued me across the empire not out of love or even desire, but out of petty cruelty and the need to possess what you couldn't control." I can make amends," Prince Alexei said desperately. "Wealth, position, anything you desire." "I desire your complete confession," Anya said, her silver eyes never leaving his face. "Written in your own hand, detailing every crime you've committed, every life you've destroyed, every abuse of power you've enjoyed." "And if I refuse?" Anya smiled, and the expression was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Then I'll strip away your protections one by one and leave you naked before every supernatural creature you've ever wronged. Do you know how many families you've destroyed over the years? How many innocents you've had killed or imprisoned? They're all out there in the darkness, Prince Alexei, and they remember." As if summoned by her words, howls began echoing through the forest around the castle, not the natural sounds of ordinary wolves, but something deeper and more purposeful. Prince Alexei's face went grey with terror as he realized that the supernatural community had indeed taken notice of his activities. "The confession," Anya repeated, gesturing to Count Dmitri's desk. "Now." With shaking hands, Prince Alexei moved to the desk and began to write. Count Dmitri watched in fascination as his beloved calmly dictated terms that would destroy one of the most powerful men in the empire. The confession was comprehensive, detailing not just his crimes against the Petrov family, but dozens of other abuses spanning nearly a decade. "There," Prince Alexei said finally, setting down the pen. "I've confessed to everything. Are you satisfied?" "Not quite," Anya replied. "You see, confessions are meaningless without consequences." Before Prince Alexei could ask what she meant, the study door opened to reveal a figure neither of them had expected. Mikhail, apparently unharmed and accompanied by several men in the distinctive uniforms of the Imperial Guard. "Uncle Dmitri," the boy called out, rushing to Count Dmitri's side. "Are you hurt? The soldiers said Prince Alexei was holding me prisoner, but I was never captured. I've been hiding in the secret passages like you taught me." Count Dmitri embraced his nephew with his good arm, his eyes questioning as he looked at the guardsman. The captain stepped forward, a grizzled veteran with intelligent eyes and a bearing that spoke of long service. "Your Excellency," he said to Count Dmitri, "I am Captain Volkov of the Imperial Guard." Anya started at the name, but the captain continued with a slight smile. "Yes, Miss Petrov, we are cousins of a sort. The Volkov family tree has many branches, and not all of us inherited the more dramatic family traits." "How did you—" Prince Alexei began, but Captain Volkov cut him off. "We've been investigating Prince Alexei's activities for months," the captain explained. "His abuse of position, his manipulation of the courts, his persecution of innocent families. We simply needed sufficient evidence to move against someone of his station." He gestured to the confession still lying on the desk. "I believe Miss Petrov has just provided that evidence." Prince Alexei looked wildly around the room, seeking escape, but found none. "You can't arrest me based on a confession given under supernatural coercion." "Actually," Captain Volkov said mildly, "we can arrest you based on the testimony of 36 witnesses who have come forward in the past month. The confession merely saves us the trouble of a lengthy trial." As the guardsman moved to restrain Prince Alexei, he made one last desperate gambit. "Wait, what about him?" He pointed accusingly at Count Dmitri. "He's a supernatural creature. The Tsar is well aware of Count Dmitri's nature and considers him a valuable ally. Captain Volkov interrupted smoothly. The Volkovs have served the crown faithfully for 3 centuries. Their unique abilities have proven quite useful in protecting Russia's interests. Prince Alexei's face collapsed as his final weapon proved useless. As the guards led him away, he called back venomously, "This isn't over. My family has power, influence." "Had power," Captain Volkov corrected. "Past tense. The Volkonsky lands are being redistributed to their rightful owners, and the family title is under review. You'll have plenty of time to contemplate your reduced circumstances during your exile to Siberia." As the sounds of Prince Alexei's removal faded, Anya felt the supernatural power that had sustained her begin to ebb. She swayed slightly, suddenly exhausted by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Count Dmitri was immediately at her side, supporting her despite his own wounds. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Anya replied, though the world seemed strangely normal now that the magic had receded. "Is it always so intense?" "The first transformation is always the most overwhelming," Count Dmitri assured her. "With time and training, you'll learn to control it completely." Captain Volkov approached them with a formal document. "Miss Petrov, by order of His Imperial Majesty, your family's full rights and properties are hereby restored. Additionally, you are granted the title of Countess in recognition of your service to the Crown." Anya stared at the document in shock. "Service? I don't understand." "Your actions tonight prevented a potential scandal that could have damaged relations between the Crown and the supernatural community," Captain Volkov explained. "His Majesty values stability above all else, and you've helped preserve it." As the guardsmen departed and quiet settled over the castle once more, Count Dmitri and Anya found themselves alone with Mikhail, who was looking at them both with wide-eyed curiosity. "Uncle Dmitri," the boy said carefully, "is Miss Petrov going to be my aunt now?" Count Dmitri looked at Anya with an expression of hope mixed with uncertainty. "That depends on whether she'll have me, now that she knows what I really am." Anya smiled, feeling more complete than she ever had in her life. "I fell in love with you before I knew about your supernatural nature, Dmitri. Learning that I share similar gifts doesn't change how I feel. It simply means we're even better matched than I imagined." Count Dmitri cupped her face in his hands, his silver eyes reflecting nothing but love and wonder. "Are you certain? A life with me won't be ordinary. There will always be dangers, responsibilities to the supernatural community, obligations that most people could never understand." "Then it's fortunate I'm not most people," Anya replied, standing on her toes to kiss him softly. "I'm a Volkov, remember. Extraordinary is what we do." As they embraced, with young Mikhail cheering in the background and the first light of dawn beginning to filter through the windows, Anya realized that sometimes the most impossible dreams were simply destiny finally catching up with you. 2 years later, Anya stood at the window of the renovated tower that served as her private study, watching the morning sun paint the Carpathian peaks in shades of rose and gold. The view had become even more meaningful to her now that she understood her connection to this ancient land and the supernatural forces that protected it. Below in the courtyard, Count Dmitri, now her husband in both law and heart, was teaching Mikhail the finer points of swordplay. At 14, the boy showed promise not just with a blade, but with the family gifts that were beginning to manifest. Under careful guidance, he was learning to communicate with the forest creatures that served as the Volkovs' allies and scouts. "Aunt Anya," Mikhail called up to her, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air. "Come see. I can make the ravens understand me now." Anya smiled and waved, then gathered her fur-lined cloak for the journey downstairs. The life she had built at Volkov Castle was beyond anything she could have imagined during those dark days, when Prince Alexei's persecution had driven her from St. Petersburg. She was no longer merely a governess, or even a rescued damsel. She was a partner in protecting both the human and supernatural communities that called these lands home. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Learning to control her inherited abilities had required months of careful study with Dmitri, who had located ancient texts written by Katerina herself. The magic that flowed through Anya's bloodline was both powerful and unpredictable, requiring constant discipline to prevent it from overwhelming her human nature. But the rewards had been immeasurable. As the Countess Volkov, Anya had established a network of safe houses throughout the empire for women fleeing dangerous situations. Her supernatural abilities allowed her to identify threats and protect the vulnerable in ways that ordinary charity work could never accomplish. She had become a guardian angel to hundreds of women and children who needed sanctuary from abuse and persecution. "My lady," came a familiar voice from the study doorway. Mrs. Volkov entered carrying a tea service and a thick packet of correspondence. "The morning dispatches have arrived from St. Petersburg." Anya accepted the letters gratefully, noting that several bore the seal of Captain Volkov, who had become their primary liaison with the imperial government. The relationship between the crown and the supernatural community had grown stronger under the current Tsar's pragmatic leadership, with families like the Volkovs serving as unofficial peacekeepers in the remote territories. The first letter contained news that made Anya smile with genuine pleasure. Prince Alexei Volkonsky had died in Siberian exile, reportedly from exposure after attempting to escape his labor camp. His death had been neither quick nor pleasant, and while Anya took no joy in suffering, she felt a deep satisfaction that justice had finally been served for her parents and the many other innocents he had destroyed. The second letter was more intriguing, a request from the Tsar himself for the Volkovs to investigate strange disappearances in the Ural Mountains. Local authorities suspected supernatural involvement, and the Crown wanted agents who could navigate both human politics and otherworldly dangers. "Another assignment?" Dmitri asked, entering the study with snow still clinging to his dark hair. "You have that expression you get when adventure calls." "The Urals," Anya confirmed, handing him the letter. "Missing travelers, frightened locals, and reports of creatures that don't match any known species." Dmitri read quickly, his silver eyes brightening with interest. "It sounds like our kind of problem. When do we leave?" "We?" Anya raised an eyebrow with mock severity. "I don't recall mentioning that you were invited on this particular mission." "My dear wife," Dmitri replied, pulling her into his arms with a grin. "Where you go, I go. That was rather the point of our wedding vows, if you recall." Anya melted into his embrace, still amazed by the depth of love and partnership they had built together. Their marriage was a true joining of equals, two powerful beings who made each other stronger rather than competing for dominance. In the darkness of their separate traumas, they had found light in each other. "Uncle Dmitri, Aunt Anya." Mikhail burst into the study with the enthusiasm of youth, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "The ravens brought news. There's a messenger approaching from the village, someone seeking sanctuary." Anya and Dmitri exchanged glances, immediately shifting into their roles as protectors. Over the past 2 years, word had spread through hidden networks that Volkov Castle was a place where the desperate could find safety, and they never turned away anyone who came to them in genuine need. They made their way to the Great Hall, where a young woman was being helped from her horse by the stablemaster. She was clearly exhausted, her clothes torn and travel-stained, her face bearing the haunted expression Anya recognized all too well. This was someone who had been running for her life. "My name is Elena Komarova," the woman said, accepting the warm drink Mrs. Volkov pressed into her hands. I was told that you help women who have nowhere else to turn." "You were told correctly," Anya said gently, settling beside the frightened young woman. "You're safe here. What happened?" Elena's story was painfully familiar. A wealthy merchant's son who wouldn't accept refusal, a family more concerned with social standing than their daughter's welfare, and finally, threats of violence when other methods of coercion failed. She had escaped in the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope that the rumors of sanctuary might be true. "He has connections with the magistrates," Elena finished, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's convinced them that I stole money from his family. There's a warrant for my arrest, and if they catch me—" "They won't catch you," Dmitri said firmly. "You have the protection of this house now." As Mrs. Volkov led Eleanor away to provide proper food and rest, Anya felt the familiar stirring of righteous anger. 2 years of marriage and countless rescue operations hadn't dulled her rage at the casual cruelty some men showed toward vulnerable women. If anything, her experiences had sharpened her determination to be a shield for those who couldn't protect themselves. "I know that look," Dmitri said quietly, watching her face. "You're already planning how to deal with Elena's pursuer." "Perhaps," Anya admitted, "though I was thinking more along the lines of long-term solutions. This merchant's son sounds like someone who would benefit from a comprehensive education about the consequences of threatening women under Volkov protection." "I do love it when you get strategic," Dmitri murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Shall we add Elena's situation to our list of matters to address during the Ural investigation?" "Efficiency in all things," Anya agreed with a smile that would have made her enemies think twice about their life choices. As evening fell over the castle, Anya found herself in their private chambers, working on correspondence with supernatural communities throughout the empire, while Dmitri reviewed reports from their network of allies and agents. It was peaceful, domestic work, but it was also the foundation of a quietly revolutionary movement that was changing how the vulnerable were protected across the vast Russian territories. "Do you ever miss it?" Dmitri asked suddenly, looking up from his papers. "The simplicity of your old life, when your biggest concern was Mikhail's Latin lessons and your greatest ambition was a quiet retirement." Anya considered the question seriously. "I miss the innocence of believing that individual kindness was enough to fix the world's problems," she said finally. "But I don't miss feeling powerless. I don't miss hiding who I really am or accepting limitations others tried to place on me." She rose from her desk and moved to the window, looking out at the forest where she had once faced death and found love instead. "That night when the wolves surrounded me, I thought my story was ending. I had no idea it was actually beginning." Dmitri joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her from behind. "And what do you think of the story so far?" "I think," Anya said, leaning back against his strength, "that it's turning out to be exactly the kind of tale I would have wanted to read as a little girl, dreaming of adventures. The heroine discovers she's more powerful than she ever imagined. She finds a love that makes her stronger rather than weaker, and she gets to spend her life protecting others who need champions." "And the hero?" Dmitri asked with gentle teasing. "How is he faring in this tale?" Anya turned in his arms to face him, her eyes bright with love and mischief. "The hero gets everything he never dared hope for, a partner who understands his nature, a love that transcends any curse or darkness, and the chance to build something meaningful with someone who sees his best self, rather than his most feared aspects." As they stood together in their tower sanctuary, surrounded by the evidence of the lives they were changing and the future they were building, Anya reflected on the strange paths that had brought them together. A prince's cruelty had driven her into a forest where wolves waited, but those same wolves had led her to the one man in all the empire who could see her true worth. Sometimes, she thought, the best fairy tales were the ones that began with the deepest darkness and ended with the brightest light. "Ready for our next adventure?" Dmitri asked, nodding toward the letters about the Ural investigation. "With you?" Anya replied, standing on her toes to kiss him softly. "I'm ready for anything." Outside their window, the wolves of the Carpathian forest raised their voices in harmonious song, as if celebrating the love story that had transformed their mistress from prey into predator, from victim into victor, from a frightened governess into a force that would reshape the very meaning of power and protection in the Russian Empire. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.